No one knew why Sergeant Dawson always wore long sleeves. Even in the thick Georgia heat, she kept her arms covered, the fabric hiding what the recruits could only guess at. Then came the day the sun pressed too hard, and she finally rolled her sleeves up. The burns twisting along her forearms caught the light, raw and unmistakable. Gasps moved down the line. One recruit found his voice. "What happened to you?" His words hung in the air, thin and uncertain. Riley didn't flinch. She looked at them, then at the horizon. "War happened," she said. But none of them expected what came next. The question lingered, and as the recruits watched her, something shifted on uneasy respect. A new silence. Morning routines continued, but the image of those scars stayed with them, following Riley into the barracks mirror as she faced the start of another day. Riley Dawson's uniform carried more than insignia, and ranket pressed close against her skin, a daily reminder of everything she'd brought back from the desert. At 530, she fastened the collar in front of the barracks mirror, the fabric catching along raised, uneven lines that never fully faded. She ignored the itch. There was no point in giving it attention. The scars had been with her since Kandahar, since the blast that left her arms marked and her gait uneven. Her old unit had called her Phoenix after she'd pulled 2 men from the fire, refusing to go down with the vehicle. The recruits didn't know that name. Not yet. Outside, boots scraped the gravel as recruits lined up. Eyes darted toward her, lingering on the slight limp as she moved toward formation. She caught a fragment of a muttered joke Private Monroe, always loud enough for her to hear, sneered. Bet she got those scars tripping over her own ego. Riley's grip tightened on her clipboard, but her face stayed still. She knew the sound of laughter meant to wound. She'd heard it before, in hospital wards and at homecomings, from people who didn't understand that scars could be proof of survival, not just reminders of pain. The morning briefing was short. Riley's orders came out clipped, her voice flat, giving nothing away. Some recruits watched her closely, curious or wary. Others kept their eyes locked ahead, trying not to stare at the pale marks twisting along her arms. She'd learned to control the story those scars told, choosing silence over explanation. It wasn't about shame. It was about refusing to be reduced to a single moment, a single injury. On the obstacle course, she demonstrated the rope climb. Her arms flexed, scars stretching as she pulled herself up, hand over hand. A few recruits exchanged glances. Monroe, still feeling bold, exaggerated her limp as he walked away from the line. Riley stopped counting. She let the silence settle, heavy and deliberate. "Problem, Private?" she asked, not raising her voice. Monroe straightened, face flushing. "No, Sergeant." She held his gaze, then turned back to the course. The lesson wasn't for him alone. It was for all of them, the ones who whispered, the ones who stared, the ones who would rather see her as a warning than as an instructor. By the end of the drill, sweat ran down her arms, making the scars stand out in the morning light. The laughter faded. In her quarters, Riley peeled off her shirt, careful with the fabric where the burns were worst. The mirror showed every jagged line, every patch of grafted skin. She traced the deepest ridge along her ribs, the one that still ached when the weather turned. She didn't linger. There was no time for that. The next morning, she rolled her sleeves up before stepping outside. Let them see. Let them wonder. She gave the day's orders and watched the recruits fall silent, eyes shifting from her scars to her face. They didn't know what it meant to wear the uniform and carry its weight long after the day was done. The scars weren't just marks. They were stories, warnings, reminders of what war could take and what it sometimes left behind. By the end of the week, the jokes had stopped. The recruits watched her with a new kind of attention. Riley kept her sleeves rolled up, not for the heat but for something else, something closer to defiance. Veterans didn't hide their injuries to avoid pity. They did it to keep from being flattened into a single story. Riley was more than what the fire had left her. If the recruits paid attention, they'd see that. The days settled into a routine, but the tension under the surface never fully faded. In the quiet between drills, Riley could sense the questions the recruits carried. It wouldn't take much for someone to test the line again. All it took was one moment, one push-up too many, for old habits to resurface. The push-up drill hit 42, when Private Vance let his arms wobble, exaggerating a limp in a quiet mockery. A couple of recruits stifled laughter behind their sleeves, but Riley's focus didn't waver. She crouched beside him, her boot grinding into the gravel, close enough for him to see the network of scars that mapped her hands. Vance's arms shook for real now, sweat pooling on the mat. Riley didn't bother with a raised voice. "You think this is funny?" She paused, letting the question hang, then continued. "Try holding form after 6 months in ICU and a year of surgeries." She straightened, eyes flicking to the distant obstacle course. Without warning, she jerked her chin toward Hill 40. "Change of plans. Full kit." The recruits hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. The air shifted as the stakes became clear. Riley's tone cut through their uncertainty. "Move." They scrambled for gear, the tension raw and immediate. Riley walked to the starting line, peeling off her outer shirt. The scars stood out under the tight undershirt, but she ignored the stares. The recruits lined up, breath already uneven. The horn sounded. Riley surged forward, reaching the wall before anyone else. She hauled herself up, arms flexing, skin stretched tight over healed burns. At the tire run, she didn't slow. On the rope climb, her prosthetic hand slipped once on the wet rope, but she recovered instantly, pulling herself higher. Mud caked her boots as she moved through the pit, never losing pace. The recruits lagged behind, their energy draining with every obstacle. Vance fell back, his face pale, struggling to keep up. At the cargo net, Riley's hands gripped the ropes, muscles working in rhythm. She didn't look back. She crossed the finish line 30 seconds ahead of the fastest recruit, sweat tracing the scars along her arms. She didn't boast. She stood quietly, watching the others stumble in, some collapsing, others bent over and gasping. Vance finished last, chest heaving. Riley checked her watch. "Pathetic," she said, voice flat. The word hung in the air. No one met her eyes. The lesson was clear: strength wasn't about being unscarred or untouched. It was about what you could endure and how you came back from it. Back in formation, the recruit stood silent. Vance's hands trembled at his sides, the earlier bravado gone. Riley let the quiet stretch, letting the reality of what they'd just witnessed settle in. She knew what they saw now wasn't just a collection of injuries, but proof of something they hadn't yet learned to value. That evening, during weapon maintenance, Vance watched her from across the room. He started to speak, but Riley only gave him a look that shut down the question before it left his mouth. The answer was obvious enough. You don't have to explain what you've already demonstrated. Night fell, and the usual banter faded early. Riley sat on her bunk, tending to the scars that still pulled tight after a day of sweat and sun. Outside, the heat pressed in. Tomorrow would bring more drills, more tests. The memory of Hill 40 lingered, and the recruits would carry it with them into the mess hall, where new lines would be drawn and old assumptions would be tested again. By noon, the mess hall filled with the low thrum of boots and metal trays, the air thick with the scent of overcooked chicken and sweat. Recruits crowded benches, shoveling food in quick mechanical motions. At one table, Monroe leaned back, waving a faded photo he'd found online, an old base newsletter shot of Riley Dawson, her face unlined, uniform crisp, no scars in sight. "Didn't know Frankenstein could clean up this well," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry. The recruits around him shifted, eyes darting to the doorway. Riley entered, tray balanced in one hand, sleeves rolled high in defiance of the heat. She moved to the table and set her tray down across from Monroe, not a word wasted. Instead, she reached into her pocket and placed her prosthetic hand on the table. The metal caught the fluorescent light, drawing every eye. "This hand, lost to an IED near Sangin. There's an article in Marine Corps Times if you want to read," she said, her tone flat. "I was pulling 3 Marines from an ambush. One of them was your cousin's squad leader." Monroe's smirk faded. Riley didn't look up, just cut into her chicken and took a bite, letting the silence settle. Monroe's fingers slipped, and the photo fluttered to the table. Riley caught it before it landed in the mashed potatoes, studying the younger version of herself for a moment before sliding it back. "Funny thing," she added, tapping the combat action ribbon pinned to her chest. "Your cousin was the one who pinned this on me. Field hospital, right after surgery." She didn't raise her voice or make a show of it. The recruits sat rigid, the usual mess hall noise replaced by a brittle quiet. Someone nudged Monroe, but he stayed silent, staring at the photo. The realization washed over him slowly. This was the same woman from the story told at family dinners, the one who'd saved half a platoon. Riley finished her meal, stood, and picked up her tray. "Latrine duty starts in 10. Monroe," she said, her voice level. "Bring a toothbrush. No anger, no lecture, just a direct order." The message landed harder than any outburst. As she walked away, Monroe scraped his chair back. "Sergeant Dawson." His voice cracked. She turned. He held out the photo, now creased from his grip. Riley reached for it, expecting a weak apology, but Monroe pulled out a second photo from his wallet, the same published shot from Marine Corps Times. Riley in dress blues, shaking hands with a Marine in a hospital bed. The connection was unmistakable. Monroe's hand shook as he offered it. "You never said." Riley handed both photos back, her expression unchanged. "Didn't figure I needed to." She left the prosthetic hand on the table, a silent reminder. Later, she found it outside her quarters, polished clean, Monroe's dog tags looped around the fingers. No note, just the weight of metal, cold and familiar in her palm. She paused, remembering the field hospital, the medics working to free her hand from a torn vest. She didn't linger on the memory. She never did. The next morning, Monroe sat alone in the mess hall. When Riley passed, he stood at attention, eyes fixed forward. The Marine Corps Times article lay folded beside his tray, creased and reread. The other recruits kept their voices low, stealing glances at Monroe's table where the prosthetic rested by his coffee. That evening, Riley found the latrine spotless, a bottle of Burn Cream homemade, not standard issue it on her bunk. She recognized the scent, aloe, and something sharp. Monroe must have called home for the recipe. She tucked it away, not for show, but because some gestures didn't need acknowledgement. She didn't seek out Monroe, didn't offer reassurance or forgiveness. Her scars weren't meant for teaching lessons, but the lesson was there all the same. Riley understood what it meant to carry things in silence, to let actions speak. Monroe's arrogance had cracked, replaced by something quieter. Respect, maybe, or the start of it. Night settled over the barracks. Riley moved through the dim corridors, her steps steady. She knew sleep would be thin, the hours restless. Some things lingered after the lights went out, and not all wounds faded with time. Sleep rarely brought relief for Riley. At 300, a scream ripped the quiet, sharp enough to jolt half the barracks awake. Riley shot upright in her bunk, hands clawing for a rifle that wasn't there, sheets tangled around her legs. Her breath came hard and fast, sweat cooling on her skin. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth, tasting blood where she'd bitten her tongue. Down the hall, Vance stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence settle back in. He didn't move, just waited for the sound of footsteps or a voice, but none came. By morning, the evidence clung to Riley's face-dark circles under her eyes, a tightness around her mouth. She moved through the range drills, with the same precision as always, correcting grips and stances, her voice low and hoarse. When she stopped beside Vance, her hand lingered a moment longer on his wrist, steadying his aim. "You're anticipating the recoil," she said, her tone flat. He almost asked about the night before, but Riley was already moving down the line, eyes locked on the next recruit. Vance watched her, noticing how she blinked too often, how her left thumb rubbed at her index finger a new habit, restless and raw. During cleanup, one recruit tried to joke about Riley, looking like she'd gone a few rounds with a ghost. Vance didn't laugh. He'd seen the way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching, the way she paused sometimes, staring through the wall. Riley herself never commented on the nightmares. Once, when asked, she'd said quietly, "Battlefield starts in the mind." The words stuck with Vance, echoing louder after every sleepless night. Later, paperwork scattered across her desk. Riley slumped into her chair, exhaustion pressing heavy on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed a message from the Alpha 7 survivor group, another name added to the memorial list. She closed her eyes and counted her breaths, the weight of loss settling in her chest. The barracks felt smaller, the air thicker. Vance appeared in her doorway, rifles stacked in his arms. He hesitated, then asked, "Sergeant, why do you stay?" Riley didn't look up at first. She turned her phone so he could see the message, the new name added to the list. "Someone's got to break the cycle," she said. Vance nodded, his mouth tight, and left her to the quiet. That night, the nightmares came back. Riley jolted awake, tangled in sheets, prosthetic arms striking the floor with a dull thud. She stayed curled in the corner, listening to her own breath. Outside her door, footsteps approached, then stopped. Someone sat down, back against the wall, a silent presence holding the space until morning. At 500, Riley opened her door to find Vance asleep in the hallway, an empty coffee cup at his side. She stepped over him without a word, but when she returned, a fresh cup waited on her desk. At breakfast, Vance took a seat at her usual table, his gaze steady. When a recruit made a crack about Riley's limp, Vance stared him down until the joke died in his throat. Riley said nothing, just took her seat across from him. The mess hall noise faded at their table, replaced by a quiet understanding. On the range that afternoon, her hands didn't shake. Vance saw it the way she moved, the way she checked her phone less, the faint ease in her shoulders. When she corrected his stance, her hand was warm. That night, the barracks stayed silent. In the morning, Riley found a note under her door. "Still here." She folded it into her pocket, next to the dog tags she carried. The weight shifted, lighter than before. Outside, the first light crept through the pines, and the day waited, full of drills and the hush of the woods pressing close. The field exercise began with orders barked over static, squads moving out under the dense green canopy. Riley watched each recruit disappear into the undergrowth, the sharp scent of pine and wet earth mixing with sweat and nerves. She kept to the edge, eyes tracking their progress, her own gear heavy on her shoulders. The plan was simply a textbook flanking maneuver, but the woods had their own agenda. Within minutes, smoke grenades burst, shouts fractured the silence, and the opposing force pressed in from all sides. Somewhere ahead, a recruit slipped, cursing as he stumbled into a thicket. Riley's focus stayed on Vance, who had frozen the moment the first blank fired. His knuckles whitened around his rifle, body rigid, breath shallow. Then, with a sudden misstep, he vanished over the lip of a ravine. The sound of him falling cut through the chaos, a short, sharp cry, and a thud that settled in Riley's chest. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing the nearest rope line, she looped it around her forearm, bracing herself for the descent. The prosthetic hand struggled to find purchase, metal fingers scraping the rope. Halfway down, the harness jerked, prosthetic catching on the strap, and Riley felt the skin beneath tear. Warm blood seeped into her sleeve, but she kept moving, boots sliding against the rock until she hit the bottom. Vance was slumped against a boulder, ankle twisted at an unnatural angle, face drained of color. Riley crouched beside him, her hands steady as she checked the injury. She unbuckled her belt, cinching it above the swelling, voice measured and low. "Breathe through it," she told him. He nodded, jaw clenched, sweat beading on his forehead. Overhead, recruits peered down, uncertain whether to intervene. Riley straightened, her vision swimming for a moment. She adjusted the prosthesis, ignoring the sting as it rubbed raw flesh. "Simulation's over," she called up. "Get a medevac line down here." Her tone allowed no argument. An hour later, the med tent was a blur of movement. Vance's ankle was wrapped and propped up, his face still pale but calm. Riley sat on a cot in the corner, sleeve rolled high as a nurse unwound the bandage beneath her prosthesis. The sores were angry and weeping. The nurse's voice was quiet but firm. "These need grafts. You're 3 months overdue for that surgery." She paused, hands gentle. "You were approved for medevac leave weeks ago. Why are you still here?" Riley flexed her fingers, testing the fresh wrapping. "Someone's got to break the cycle," she said, rolling her sleeve back down. Vance waited outside the tent, balancing on crutches. He fell in beside her as she walked, matching her pace despite the awkward rhythm. The other recruits watched their approach. Expressions changed, no more mockery, just a new kind of respect. Riley scanned their faces, reading the bruises, the dirt, the questions they wouldn't ask out loud. On the parade ground, the sun pressed down hard. Riley took her place at the front, shadow stretching over the gravel. Vance stood beside her, crutches sinking into the dust. She didn't send him to join the others. "Debrief in 10, she announced, and the recruits scattered, moving with purpose. Only Vance stayed, eyes on the dried blood at her sleeve. Riley met his gaze. "Problem, Private?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, Sergeant." She nodded, turning toward the briefing tent. Vance followed, slower but determined, his crutches scraping against the ground. At the entrance, Riley held the flap just long enough for him to pass through, nudging his crutch free with her boot. For the first time, Vance didn't flinch at the sight of her scars. Inside, the recruits sat ready, notebooks open, attention fixed. Riley took her place at the front. To her, it was just another rescue. Outside, footsteps approached brass, making their rounds, the next inspection about to begin. General Coleman arrived with little fanfare, his aide trailing behind, clipboard in hand. The inspection line stretched across the parade ground, boots squared, rifles held just so, but the tension was different this morning. When the general stopped in front of Riley, the air seemed to compress. He didn't bother with the usual handshake or salute. Instead, he stepped in close and pulled her into a brief, tight embrace. "Scat. Dawson. Phoenix, still burning bright," he said, his voice carrying down the line. The recruits stood frozen, eyes straight ahead, not daring to react but catching every word. Riley's expression didn't shift, but something in her shoulders eased, just for a moment. General Coleman moved on, leaving a ripple of questions in his wake. The call sign hung in the air, Phoenix. It was the first time most of the recruits had heard it. They didn't ask, but the mess hall buzzed with speculation. A staff sergeant filled the silence over breakfast, voice low but insistent. "Phoenix wasn't handed out for nothing," he said, pushing his tray aside. "She crawled through fire in Kandahar, pulled 3 Marines out of a burning Humvee, took shrapnel to the face and arms. Doc said she'd never walk again." He nodded toward the window where Riley stood in the sun, scars catching the light. "That's not just a nickname. That's a story." The rumors traveled fast, but the facts were buried deeper. Vance found the after-action report later that day, tucked in the training office archives. The document was unclassified, but the details were clinical coordinates, casualty counts, timestamps. One line caught his eye. SSGT. Dawson extracted 3 personnel from wreckage, despite suffering catastrophic burns. Continued rescue efforts until loss of consciousness. There was a supplement at the end, a note from the chopper pilot. Rescued with Riley's hand still tangled in his vest straps. "Tell Dawson she did good," it read, the words written in a shaky hand. Vance sat with the report for a long time, turning the pages, trying to picture the smell of burning nylon, the sting of smoke in the back of the throat, the weight of 18 months in a burn unit. He understood now why Riley moved the way she did, why her scars mapped every inch of exposed skin. The call sign wasn't a label. It was an earned mark, a record of survival and sacrifice. That evening, the training office was empty except for Riley, hunched over a stack of forms under a single lamp. Vance placed the after-action report on her desk and waited. She didn't look up. "You read it?" she asked. He said yes. "Questions?" He shook his head, then remembered she couldn't see him. "No, Sergeant." The silence stretched. Then Vance spoke again. "General called you Phoenix." Riley set her pen down, turning her arm to show the patchwork of skin. "Medical staff started it. Graphs kept failing. They said I kept burning through them." She glanced at the report, then at Vance. "Would you have believed it if I told you?" He hesitated, then answered honestly. "No. Not until he'd seen her outpace them all, carry them through drills, never break." Riley gathered the papers. "Medals get framed. Reports get filed. Neither tells the whole story." She capped her pen. "Dismissed." Vance lingered, then asked, "Does it still hurt?" Riley didn't answer right away. "Every day," she said, voice barely above a whisper. The base returned to its routine trucks rumbling, voices drifting from the barracks. In the morning, Riley stood at formation, sleeves rolled high in the rising heat. The recruits watched her differently, silent but attentive, as if the story had changed the way they saw the scars. A package arrived from headquarters, addressed in block letters. Inside was a new nameplate for Riley's desk, SSGT, Dawson, and beneath it, Phoenix. She left it visible, untouched, a quiet acknowledgement. The weight of the name, like the scars, rested in plain sight. As the sun climbed, the training shifted to survival drills, the heat pressing down and uniforms clinging to every line and mark. The recruits fell in behind Riley, the call sign echoing in their minds, the meaning settling in as they followed her lead deeper into the day. Heat pressed down on the survival training site, sweat soaking through every layer of fabric. Riley called a water break, her voice flat and unhurried. Recruits dropped their packs and gathered by the tree line, gulping water, still catching their breath from the last round of drills. Without fanfare, Riley reached for her jacket zipper and slid it down. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, drawing every eye without a word. The scars were impossible to ignore. Pale tracks of shrapnel fanned across her left side, some faded to white, others angry and pink. Burns wrapped her rib cage, skin tight in places, uneven in others. The recruits went quiet. One let his canteen slip, water sloshing into the dirt. Riley didn't flinch. She traced a jagged ridge near her collarbone. This one stopped a ricochet. Would have hit my radio man right in the throat. Her finger moved to a sunken patch below her ribs. This held my guts in for 8 hours while they cleared the LZ. She turned, showing the worst of Ite, twisted mass at her hip. Pigskin grafts here. Shrapnel from a mortar round took out the rest. No one laughed. No one whispered. The silence was heavy, not just from discipline but from something new. The scars explained more than she ever could in words. They were a mapone that told the truth about where she'd been and what it cost to come back. She shrugged the jacket back on, letting it hang off one shoulder. Breaks over. Move. The recruits scrambled to their feet. This time, they didn't drag or complain. The sun beat down, but no one asked for another rest. They pushed harder, legs burning, faces set. Something had shifted. Vance, usually first to grumble, took point, jaw tight, eyes forward. After the drill, as the others packed up, Vance lingered near the equipment shed. He held out a framed photothay, the one he'd once used as a joke now carefully set behind glass. His dog tags rested in the corner of the frame. He didn't say anything. Riley took it, her grip steady. There was no apology, just a silent acknowledgement of what those scars meant. For the first time, Vance stood a little straighter. Later, a recruit would remember that moment and think, for the first time, I wished I could earn scars like that. Back in the barracks, the usual banter faded. Whispers circled. Not about Riley, but about the stories written on her skin. One recruit traced his own unmarked arm, wondering what it would mean to come back with wounds worth showing. Riley sat on her bunk, the framed photo on her footlocker. She brushed her fingers over the glass, feeling the weight of the tags inside. The names of the dead scrolled across her phone, reminders of those who hadn't made it home. That night, she rolled her shoulders, feeling the scar tissue pull and settle. Outside, gravel crunched under the night watch's boots. She lay back, the photo catching what little light slipped through the window. In the morning, the recruits waited at the obstacle course before she arrived. They stood taller, eyes clearer, the silence between them filled with something unspoken. No one mentioned the scars or the survival drill, but the change was there. A few asked for extra field exercises, eager to test themselves in ways that mattered. Riley didn't comment. She gave the order to begin, watching as they moved with a focus she hadn't seen before. She kept her sleeves rolled up a little higher. Not for them, but for herself, a small reminder that some lessons needed to be seen to last. The days moved on. The photo Vance had framed found its way to a new recruit's locker, the glass smudged from curious hands. Riley never asked about it. She didn't need to. The scars had spoken, and the lesson held. The end of training crept closer, the routine giving way to ceremony. The recruits adjusted their uniforms, boots hitting the ground in practiced rhythm, ready for whatever came next. Families filled the bleachers, the morning sun glinting off dress uniforms and rows of polished medals. The cadence of the parade was sharp, every movement drilled and measured. General Coleman stood at the reviewing stand, his eyes sweeping across the line of new Marines. When he reached Riley, he paused, microphone in hand, and let the silence stretch. Staff Sergeant Dawson Phoenix. "Still burning bright," he announced, his voice clear enough for every parent and recruit to hear. "Hero of Kandahar, survivor of Sangin. If you want to know what courage looks like, look at her." The recruit stood taller, the weight of the name settling over the field. Vance accepted his certificate with a steady grip. No speech, just a nod. Instead of joining the celebration, he stepped out of formation and approached Riley. He handed her a simple request: additional combat training, a chance to test himself beyond the basics. Riley scanned the paper, her face unreadable. She reached for the ink pad in her pocket, pressing her signature beside the request. The scars on her hand caught the light as she set the paper aside. "Earn it," she said, her tone even. "And remember why." Vance didn't offer thanks. He saluted, holding it a second longer than necessary. Riley returned it, prosthetic fingers curled in practiced rhythm. He slipped back into line, blending with the others as the parade dismissed. After the ceremony, the field cleared quickly. Parents gathered their sons and daughters, voices low, snapping photos against the backdrop of flags and sunlight. Riley walked the length of the empty parade ground, the scent of cut grass and boot polish lingering in the air. The general's words echoed in her mind, the call signs still fresh. She felt the breeze lift her sleeves, the scars exposed but no longer hidden. She didn't linger on the crowd or the applause. Instead, she found herself alone at the edge of the field, watching shadows stretch across the asphalt. Somewhere, Vance would be preparing for the next phase, his request for advanced training already in motion. She didn't wonder if he would remember the lessons she knew. The fire always found a way to test what you'd learned. In her office that evening, Riley sorted through evaluations. Vance's file stood out. High marks, a note in the margin. Learn to ask why. She filed it away, leaving the comment untouched. The next morning, a new class waited outside, eyes flicking to her scars when they thought she wasn't watching. Riley let them look. She rolled her sleeves up, voice steady as she called them to order. A recruit with a quick smile and too many questions glanced at her prosthetic hand as she demonstrated the rope climb. "What happened to your hand, Sergeant?" he asked. Riley gripped the rope one-handed, her movement smooth. "Lost it," she said, pulling herself upward. The recruit hesitated, then tried for himself, arms shaking but determined. By midday, the questions faded. The recruits watched her pace, saw the way she moved, The control in every demonstration. They didn't ask about the scars they saw, what mattered in the way she led them forward. That night, Riley sat at her desk, the light low. Her phone buzzed a photo from an unknown number. Vance stood in front of a distant outpost, sleeves rolled up, the sun setting behind him. She saved the image. No reply needed. When you see a veteran's scars, remember the lives they saved. Outside, the lights of the base glowed against the dark. Riley leaned back, the scars on her arms catching the faint reflection in the window. The day was finished, but the story pressed on, quiet and unbroken. In the quiet of her office, Riley's gaze rested on the framed photo of Vance, and the nameplate marked Phoenix. Both sat on her desk, the dog tags visible behind the glass, a silent record of what had been earned. Not given. The day's light faded over the empty parade ground, but the symbols of respect remained in view. Voiceover. 1 second of hesitation is all it takes. Scars last, not just on skin but in memory. They remind us what was risked and what was saved. The camera lingered on Riley's desk, the photo and nameplate side by side. If you know someone with scars like these, share their story below. Honor what they carried and what they chose to protect.